design. We're passionate about this. We believe this is the right thing to be doing. How do we organize ourselves to achieve that? A lot of yesterday was as well community building. And I think that included a lot of folks who went to the Five Horses last night and had a good time to continue the conversation. Networking solicitation along the same type of thing as well. You know, for most of us, while many had been on dozens of Zoom meetings together, some many more than that, it was the first time for a lot of people to meet face to face. And I think with the motion initiative that we're undertaking, we just recognize we need people from a whole swath of areas, and they don't necessarily go right now at the moment to any of the same conferences. So this is a type of networking event that is really important for bridging across areas. Breakout group discussions, I thought were absolutely excellent. At the beginning of the last breakout round in group 3, I think we started pretty soft, but then by the end of it, I think we could have stayed another half hour. So I think these things evolved very nicely. One of the things recognized shared mission and values. And, you know, Farah kicked it off yesterday with a list of 5 items, which is why are we in this together? What are the critical challenges that are facing us? And how do we need to work together to achieve it? And so I think there's a very like mindset and commitment that you need for these types of longer term enterprises. I like Jamie Lisinski's comment, you know, it's not a money issue. You know, it really isn't. You know, there's so much money in the system going to the development of these projects and a lot of interest of them being successful, and successful includes being acceptable and welcomed such that further offshore wind energy can be developed. And as I did in my little bit of the introduction yesterday, I said, we're not, you know, this industry isn't going to go very far unless it does good things for the marine environment and those people who presently use the water and future users of the ocean environment as well. And it can be a win-win-win, I think, but it's going to take time and effort and commitment to achieving that. Technology worked, so the people online, that was something to be truly thankful for. And my one regret, I counted about a dozen people that would have been great to have also been here who were so much involved in the discussions over the time. But I think it was, our expectation was at least we'll have the leads for the focus areas get together. We're going to have a kickoff meeting. We'll do the big thing, you know, down in the New Bedford area in June. So this was just going to be, hey, maybe we'll start off with just a meeting of 15 or 20 people. And then we said, you know what, let's invite, you know, a little bit of a larger circle. And I think the size of the circle that we had yesterday and today is really quite suitable for advancing things. So Jay does professional facilitator. I asked Jay, hey, you've been in a ton of these. How did we do?
So I always ask the people who are having the experience, how did you do? And I heard that people really enjoyed the focused conversation around the 2 slides and the idea of all the prep that went into the conversations that were teed up yesterday. People said to me it was a productive use of your time, which is a big compliment to the process. I sensed a real collegial atmosphere, which was really enjoyable. I love the fact that some of the industry panelists stayed on throughout the whole day. They didn't have to do that, but they seemed to fully engage. Dan mentioned that the groups needed more time, and maybe that's part of our conspiracy to leave you hungry for more. The part of the collegial atmosphere was friendly amendments, so I think all the slides you'll see today are improved over what they were yesterday from the input from folks. And just, you know, as the day went on, the groups got smaller, but the energy and the contribution was still really high. And so I really appreciated that. So glad to have you all back, and I'm going to just see the fruits of our work yesterday today.
Thank you. So for today, this is our welcome. We're going to have a presentation from the 6 focus areas, and then we're going to have a wonderful talk from Greg Watson. I've seen the slides, and yesterday, Greg, I asked at the start, how many people you know Greg Watson? And there was like 6 or 8 people in the room who put up their hands. Some aren't here today, but your reputation precedes you.
I owe them all money, probably.
Yeah. So then we'll have a break. Then we'll report on the goals. And I'm going to talk a little bit about marketing and engagement. We'll have lunch, and then we're going to come back here and talk about what we learned. And so we'll do that as indicated here. And then we have, that's the end of the official workshop. Anybody who's here, and this is a great time to talk, dialogue, post-process. So if you're interested in hanging around and having a discussion, that would be great. I'll ask this again at 1 o'clock, but if anybody's going to still be in the Boston area tonight, because maybe they have a train or a flight tomorrow or anything like that, it'd be great to go to dinner, Motions Treat. So I'll ask that question at 1 o'clock to see if anybody's interested and get a show of hands. Jay.
Yeah. So don't go too far, Dan, because I'm going to be calling you back up here in a minute. What we're going to do this morning is we're going to walk through the focus area presentations, and it's an opportunity to people can ask questions. There could be clarifying questions. People can share comments. Dan, we have a link that people can take notes on, either remotely or in the room in real time for the presenters.
And that was in the agenda. So if some people, particularly folks who are online, if you want to make comments along the way and make sure that they are seen for subsequent discussion, please go that and make comments. We're going to keep that Google Doc up for a period of time, and there'll be a follow-up email after the workshop that continues to invite people to make comments in these areas. And so it'll be an evolving document until as we come up with a plan for next steps.
So we'll give each focus group lead 12 minutes, and you can use that time as you wish. You could take questions during the time if you want, or save them for the end, but we only have 12 minutes to give. And Dan is going to go first as focus area 1. Right. I'll get more interventionists as we get closer to the 12 minutes.
Just before we get underway, we have a lot of people introduce themselves in detail in the workouts last day. We have a few visitors. So Jen, Jessica, James, see if anybody else I'm missing. Do you want to just stand up and say who you are and where you're from? I won't have everybody else do it because it'd take too long, but at least for the 3 of you folks who weren't here yesterday.
If I have to. I'm Jennifer Menard, I'm the Vice President of Economic and Business Development at Bristol Community College. Hi, Eric, and I oversee the National Offshore Wind Institute, which is a workforce training institute for maritime and offshore wind.
Hi, I'm Jessica Trombley. I'm the director of the National Offshore Wind Institute. It's great to see you all again.
James Burns, I'm Domestic Collaborative Director of Programs and Operations, and I unofficially lead our Blue Economy Initiative.
One more person who's going to be introduced more later, but Greg, at least say your name and who you are, and then Fair is going to introduce you at the time of your talk.
So say my name and who I am. Is that different than?
That's
no, I'm sorry. Greg Watson with Schumacher Center for New Economics, and working on a project called the World Game and World Grid. As conceived by Bucky Fuller.
Thank you. So at the working group breakout group discussions, the focus was on developing 2 slides. One slide's where we want to be in 2 years' time in terms of what types of goals and potential deliverables, and then what to do in the next 6 months. And so almost everybody just has those 2 slides. I put in a few extras to use as an example, but yeah, I know. That's cheating. So one thing is we want to establish objectives, and what is nature inclusive design? We had some discussion with the panel on that yesterday, and there's not an easy, clean definition, but we need to be thinking about what would be appropriate objectives given our location, given our time frame, given our skill sets, given communities, etc. Publish a globally authored technical report on nature inclusive design. When Farah and I were overseas, I think we measured very great interest in collaborating and working together. And there's nothing better than trying to produce a report together to force interactions. Have 1 or more nature inclusive pilot projects underway. And there is already one that I think we have a high degree of confidence is going to proceed. And that's sort of a little bit on my couple extra slides. And I thought it's useful to think about that one and what its objectives is and how that ties into supporting other focus areas and goals. Create a structure for how we value nature inclusive design. We talked about the Netherlands example. We talked about societal cost of energy. We have to find a way of valuing it one way or another. As much as the folks on the industry panel were very much committed to this, they also sort of said, well, you know, we have to be able to illustrate this, including to the other people at their company, for this to be a core aspect of what they're trying to accomplish with their projects. Types of data and metadata and the challenge over IP. I know this crossed through a large number of discussions yesterday, so we chatted about it as well. And we recognize we need to find ways to make progress for that. As we have workshops throughout, we want to have broad and extensive participation. Today was, and yesterday was, is a little bit more modest, but as we think about future workshops and online workshops, we have to carefully consider how to invite people into the conversations, all the pre-meetings, et cetera, because unless we have relationships going in, meetings and workshops aren't necessarily successful. Lots of opportunities out there, so we should be continuing to work with our states, federal agencies, industry, and others to advance nature inclusive design. And one of the comments that Jamie made yesterday, she said actually in so many areas, industry is ahead of where the public sector is. And so we need to be taking advantage of those things. Power purchase agreements, ultimately, you know, I think that's both a carrot and a stick, but there's one of the things that groups of people, both industry and academia, agencies and others, we are in a position with if we have a common voice, just like has occurred in some cases in Europe, to actually push for changes in what goes into solicitations that can advance these objectives. So activities through June of 2024, formation a group willing to author the report, right? Well, we can get underway right away and create an outline for what such a report could be. Establish industry funded project on nature inclusive design. So we mentioned this a little bit in some of the group discussions, but we have a couple of industry players who are interested in helping launch a project where we're looking at impact of materials and geometry, et cetera, on marine growths and habitats. So we're looking forward to getting a project underway that can serve as a role model as well for some other types of projects. And I know collectively we're all engaged in a lot of different things relevant to nature inclusive design of offshore wind farms. Find ways to effectively respond to the RFPs and FOAs and how those efforts increase and deepen our relationships. And express and market importance of nature inclusive design to agencies, industry, and society. And I would say we've been doing this for quite some period of time. Presentations, we have other projects by these funding entities, and we slip it into the conversations. We slip it into proposals that didn't call out for something in nature inclusive design, but we put it in there and to increase knowledge, awareness, and perhaps maybe not that solicitation, a future solicitation that will provide resources for advancing this. Assess use by different groups on offshore wind and nature inclusive design. We talked a lot yesterday about acceptability, and this, you need to have the relationships from the start. It was great that Mike Pohl was here from ROSA. Great that Tom is here, who's worked with the groups at ROTA, and New Bedford Ocean Cluster was a dominant part of the team in putting together the proposal. And so I think there's the kernels of those relationships and groups and communities have formed. We don't necessarily have to try and set up anything ourselves, but we need to make sure that we have liaisons, you know, we're seeing if we should be in the room as other people are having conversations. Whole global online workshop on nature inclusive design. Meeting in person is great. Nature inclusive design, it's a very global group of people working on it, so it probably needs to be that way. And how am I doing? Am I
Half your time.
half my time?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm doing actually okay then. I was worried. further establishing our website as a strong resource for nature inclusive design. There's a bunch of other resources out there as well. I would say that by and large, most of them are sort of focused on the work that they do, as opposed to being a portal to letting people know what everybody else is doing. And you can imagine us, and I'm going to talk about engagement at 11:30. And as part of engagement, I'm going to share a little bit about what's on the website, one of the types of things that we could be adding to it. And identify unique strengths in the US and our region to advancing nature inclusive design. And these comments were made by the panel yesterday. Then when it was asked, what types of new talent is needed to do this advancement, and they basically said, you folks are so well positioned to be able to do this. And when I say you folks, it's the group within our region. I always make the comment that Woods Hole is to marine ecology and marine studies as Houston is to oil and gas. But it's not just Woods Hole, right? We have a number of dominant, great things happening along the coastal regions. And so we're very fortunate in our area, and I think that's recognized by those in Europe. So when Farah and I were in meetings with developers and others, they have started to very much recognize the expertise that we have. And obviously everything depends on the specific environment that you're in. And our environment is very different than the North Sea. And so they recognize the importance of partnering with us. I said I was going to, I'm going to do a little bit example, just do it very quickly. So along the theme of working with others, and that was Jamie's one recommendation when everybody was asked to make one recommendation. Her says, learn from others, be aware of what's ongoing. And we have a book table in room 208. And if you look through the publications, people have been doing a lot of work in this area for quite some period of time. And when it comes to something as simple as different types of structures that we put in the ocean environment to help develop habitats, there's a lot of people working in this space, and we need to learn from them. The report Turbine Reefs features, I think, about 15 companies working in this space. I think there's probably about 30 companies working in this space at least. So let's work and partner with them. One of the things I think when you look at what various companies are doing, and entrepreneurs, they are building things, different material composition, textures, et cetera, putting them in and see what grows. I think one of the things we bring key to the specific aspects of our region is very much a focus on the marine science aspects and developing models. And for that, you need different types of sensing systems, et cetera. So when you see these exploratory projects that are out there, well, people have measured beneficial effects, mainly it's video, right? But there's so many other things that we can do to learn. Example of partnering, Atma mentioned he's on the advisory panel for a project that eConcrete just got through the NYSERDA-led Department of Energy Consortium. I'm on the same panel, so we have these relationships, and we should figure out what others are doing so we don't replicate. This was something as well from the same company. And whenever you get into these relationships, and on the right is Prysmian, so the group building the cable factory in the state is also engaged already in some of these areas. So that's extremely exciting. So Prysmian, where it's going in the old Brayton Point coal-fired generating station. When we think about working with others, and Deltaris has a big project that they are launching looking at textures, mineral composition, and geometry on marine growths. And what can we do to sort of contribute to and benefit those groups? We don't have to necessarily repeat, but we can be doing things that are extremely complementary in terms of other ways of impacting these structures, perhaps working on things related to surface coatings and other types of mineral compositions that some of these other groups are not looking at. And also to bring technology in there. So there you go, Colleen. So Colleen, Laura always says Colleen is the best at naming different types of sensing systems. So this one is called Disco. I'm not sure if I can completely pronounce it, but the full description. But I didn't leave any times for Q&A. I know I'm going to be back up here, so I'll let Colleen get right into focus area 2.
Good way, Colleen.
All right. That picture, it just comes back to haunt me all the time. Gotta find it, get rid of it. Anyway, I'm Colleen Hansel. I think I met most of you or all of you over the course of yesterday. So I'm hoping that I'm not going to take the full 12 minutes and like leave it time for other members who are in the focus area too, to make sure to correct the things that I didn't say or said incorrectly. But so we came up with, mainly 3 kind of deliverables that we're thinking about by the end of next year. So, you think of 2 years as a long time, and it really isn't. So we wanted to try to come up with a reasonable set of deliverables. And first and foremost is to establish what should the working group be. So who should be in the ocean sciences and monitoring working group, and making sure that we're having a diverse, collaborative group of people that crosses all the different stakeholders and includes many different sectors and academia, NGOs, offshore wind industry, as well as fisheries, and making sure that, we're being really inclusive in that. So that's something that we feel is kind of first and foremost. Secondly, is to come up with, a report in some manner, whether or not that's a white paper or some sort of perspective, to try to really come up with, what do we need to measure and how within ocean sciences in the context of nature inclusive design and offshore wind. And so we spent a good chunk of our 1 hour yesterday talking about what is biodiversity, because that means a lot to a lot of different people, and your perspective and where your background is and how you view that. And so we're kind of stuck with that word, right? It's used. The UN is now, calling for an increase in biodiversity within the ocean. So we're not going to get away from the word. So we have to really define what it means to us. And so we think that that's kind of one of the first things that we need to do as a group, because we can't really monitor biodiversity. We can't really measure biodiversity if we don't really know what we're trying to do. So that was kind of one of the first things we talked about quite a bit. And then, can we actually come up with a subset of targets to measure that will be a proxy for biodiversity as we end up identifying it? And so, that could be commercially relevant species, endangered species, invasive species, or some combination thereof, that we are really going to have we can't just measure it all, right? That's unrealistic and also just not going to be very effective. So we have to come up with what are the targets that we want to actually assess biodiversity as it relates to the impact of offshore wind and our efforts at increasing nature inclusive design. Off of that then is also, we have to be thinking about the ocean as a whole, so not just biodiversity, but how are we impacting kind of ocean health, ocean function, productivity in those wind farms, and how are our efforts at including nature inclusive design impacting that either negatively or positively, or both. And so there again, we could be measuring a lot of different chemical, biological, and physical targets. So we need to kind of come up with that list of, what do we think are the core measurements, the core parameters that we really need to measure. From there, we talked a little bit about standardization. So how do we standardize across, all of our efforts at, when we're assessing impact? We need some sort of standard and normalization so that we can actually compare data across wind farms, across groups that are doing this work. We need some metrics of success as well. So what are we considering a positive impact versus a negative impact? So, that's kind of thinking in the context of, what are we going to measure? And then we moved on to how do we measure it? So then we need to figure out, what sensors, what instruments, what approaches, what platforms do we already have for making these measurements for the targets that we're coming up with for biodiversity and ocean health. And then, what instruments and sensing modalities are already available, and then what ones do we need? So what technological developments do we need moving forward? And so, and then lastly, and I think that a lot of the groups talked about this, was data. How do we most effectively and most appropriately collect, house, aggregate, and then share that data? So, that's a huge undertaking that's going to take a lot of collaboration, a lot of effort between, all of the different stakeholders in this. And it really is a little bit of a huge obstacle to get over in terms of what we're gonna do with this data once we collect it. So that's kind of it's a lot to kind of put into one report, but that was kind of where we thought at the end of next year, it would be really nice to have a consensus on this. So across the working group, and then within the working group, and then also across, like we'd like to collaborate with the other working groups, obviously, and like get input into, you know, kind of this idea. And then lastly, kind of, you know, as we, over the next couple years, you know, be thinking about how can we identify and respond to any RFPs, solicitations that come out that could advance some of these ideas. For instance, you know, some, you know, new sensor that we deem necessary for one of the key targets, you know, how can we help make that happen over the next couple years? Okay, so over the next 5 months, which is not a lot of time, again, we tried to be a little bit, what do we want to get done before the retreat was this, how we viewed it. And we really had about 3 minutes to do this slide because we've spent like the whole 65 minutes on the other slide. So, so I'd love for the other members of the working group to add to this. So our activities, we think over the next 5 months are really going to focus not on trying to have a lot of meetings. We're all zoomed out and we're going to have this large retreat in the summer, but instead try to you know, have some online documents that we're editing, commenting on within the focus area and trying to advance it that way so that we can go to the retreat already with some ideas in hand so that we're not walking in with a blank slate. Well, first again is let's start coming up with a list of other people that we need to bring into the working group and then reach out and try to establish those connections before the retreat and include them in the retreat. So that's kind of one of the first things we need to do. And then, you know, again, kind of trying to come to a consensus on this definition of biodiversity. So I think that's going to take some time because we all come with a very different background. So I think, you know, kind of trying to hone in on that idea a little bit. And then lastly, I think it was Drew who mentioned, you know, we should come into the retreat with a list of parameters of what and the targets that we want to measure, and then we can let everybody poke holes in that list, and then add and change, you know, and essentially then leave the retreat with that information kind of well refined. And so we're going to have a document that we're going to all work on together, that we're going to essentially start proposing what are the target species we should be looking at. And that's going to be regional as well. So we got to be thinking about how we're going to approach that on a regional perspective. And then what ocean measurements that we can add, and then start compiling this list of what are the monitoring assessment needs and what technologies and sensing modalities do we have in hand and what do we need. So that's kind of where we came at. I don't know if anybody else, I don't know if I have time. I thought it was, yeah. So if anybody else in the focus area wants to add to that, that's kind of where we ended yesterday. I don't know if I summarized. It's hard to summarize like 65 minutes and 15 bullet points. Loretta.
Yeah, I just comment. I was in focus area 3 and we talked about there's a lot of overlap between
Yes.
focus areas, monitoring needs, and so you know, just coordinating that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that would be great. Josh.
Yeah, and I echoing what Loretta said, I totally agree. And the other thing too is in the next 5 months, there's going to be a whole series of workshops that are being offered by different groups on particularly monitoring technologies in and around wind farms that are being hosted by like RWSC and MTS and other. DOE has put some funds to RWSC to do a series of workshops. And so we should just be aware, I think, is motion for both. I think it's particularly relevant to focus area 2 and 3 to participate in those things. So we should make sure we communicate out when they're happening.
Yeah, maybe we can start kind of a document so we can put them on our calendar ahead of time too.
Master calendar.
A master calendar, yeah, before.
Just being present in those different workshops. Many of them are going to be virtual, I think.
Okay.
So it makes it a little easier. Gives people a chance to fill out their Tetris calendars for Zoom calls.
Yeah. Well, and having some sort of summary document from those workshops for those who can't attend would also be really helpful. All right.
Great. Josh, you pick up. A little acknowledgement for this group here.
I have to have an image on a slide. I have a hard time just all text, so. This is the Future Fisheries Group, and we had a really great discussion. I think one of the key takeaways for me from that is that what I think including this focus area in the motion plan really allows us to sort of broaden maybe for some the definition of what nature inclusive design is, right? And so we're thinking about nature inclusive design as being inclusive of commercial and recreational fishing and thinking of a way to have that be sustained and the research innovation discussions that we can have. So when we think about, I will say it was such a relief because together we were able to, I think, put more realistic goals and objectives in a 2-year timeframe than what maybe was drafted originally in the slides that were put together. So I kind of put this into 2 categories of deliverables and goals, right? The goals of this group after the 2 years is to clearly participate in the different gatherings and convenings that we have. But we want to actually define what success looks like for future fisheries. You know, what does that 10-year out vision of how do we see that we're successful, that we do have sustained commercial and recreational fishing? What does that actually look like? It may not be status quo of, oh yeah, people are able to continue to operate their businesses as they do now. It might be even, as some suggested in the group, and advance and even more economic benefit in taking advantage of different things, right? So that's a key goal. We scaled back a little bit because Dan told us very clearly that we have no money to do research. And so we can't actually build a tool, but we can develop a strategy of what a tool might look like and leverage others. So this tool, and I'll talk a little more about it on the next slide, is a means in which to enable future fisheries to happen, taking advantage of the data sets, the models that are out there, the clever ways that the AI and machine learning communities can integrate some of those things to build purpose tools that allow for strategic decisions to be made for future fisheries to happen, given this vision that we haven't made yet of what that actually is, right? We want to leverage activities, and we'll talk a little bit about that. We were fortunate to have Daphne and Tom both here because we talked about a lot of the ideas behind this that went into the type 2 proposal that we put in last year was based on collaborative work that Daphne and Tom have been engaged in for years. I cautiously say decade, but I don't want to date either of you. So, but so that powerful partnership came up with some ideas of what an initial tool might look like. And so there's opportunities to leverage. There may be funding already there that we can start to explore some of those things. And the group agreed that thinking about a shellfish-based tool, exploring an idea that's already been proposed jointly between industry and the academic and the scientific community would be a good place to start, just to demonstrate what this thing is. So people can recognize that. And then we have a goal right at the end to have some meaningful contribution to what a type 2 proposal might be in the future, right? So we recognize that. The way that we get there in the 2 years is really primarily through interactions of this group, but through 2 workshops, right? The first workshop focused on the deliverable of what does future fisheries actually look like? What does successful future fisheries look like? So this would be, and look, Dan, we even put a date on it, right? We're thinking fall, and we would make sure that we're representing commercial and recreational fishing here, right? So it's what does future fisheries success look like for both of those communities of fishers? Have them there, and the result of that would be some sort of publication that actually maps out what we think as a community future fisheries success looks like for both recreational and commercial. It may be similar, it may be different. The second is focusing on this pilot tool. And so we think that would be a good spring 2025 activity. And there we would think about potentially data-driven or model-driven tools that would be focused on benthic and some of the shellfish communities and pelagic. And these are not fish tools, these are fisheries tools, right? So thinking about the socioeconomics as well as the natural variability in the system and the population dynamics of the species in question. And the outcome of that would really be this strategy document that would inform some immediate, we think, products that could come out in a type 2, given what we've learned about the NSF criteria for some of those proposals. So this has a lot more words on it because I wanted to capture the discussion, but where we want to do, where we want to get by June, this is not indicative of a lot of work. The first one was like super ambitious. This one may look like ambitious because it has a lot of text, but this is what we think we can do this by June in time for the retreat. One is really clearly defining this mission statement for this particular focus area. We can review the literature. There are existing tools that are out there. Some of the creators of those tools are in this room and part of the Motion partnership, which is really good. So we can just identify those. We can develop some of the high-level plans for the workshops that we talked about. And again, those workshops are focused on those 2 bullets, defining future fishery success and advancing these data-driven dynamic tools. We would be planning for and starting to outline goals, objectives, format for the workshops. Again, workshop 1, focusing on the vision for the future fisheries. Workshop 2, focusing on that tool development. And this is where we're engaging a lot of different groups, right? So it's the environmental and fisheries data requirements. It's also thinking about the AI machine learning experts that we can bring into the room, looking at, again, these will generally be dynamic habitat projections of some type and what technologies. And so this, I think, is particularly where the overlap with focus area 2 comes in. Even in future fishery success, I think there's just a lot of overlap. And then the last bullet there is just identifying some of the folks that we want to make sure are in the room for those workshops. And the one that I think was added beyond what we had before is the fisheries economists, right? So really bringing in that socioeconomic piece to these discussions. And the goal in June would be that we'd have a plan, date set, and again, not sure how we merge this together. It's one of the questions that I had in putting these slides together is, you know, some of these workshops and some of these convenings may have enough overlap where we want to combine them and have different breakouts and things like that. So that's where we are with this. And I invite any of those that were in the room that may catch something that I missed. What questions? Or others think that we totally missed the ball on something, please tell us. Uh-oh, Dan?
No, it wasn't related to the totally missing the ball whatsoever. When you were talking about workshops, right, there's things that we can centrally host, there's in-person, there's all online, there's hybrid, but then there's communities out there that are already meeting. Did you folks discuss potentially even the merit of, well, if the fisheries community are getting together in this time, this location, maybe then a good thing to do is to organize the workshop potentially to be associated with that?
Yeah.
Or where, how did you debate, or what are your personal thoughts about the different types of workshop options that would be most effective?
I think as efficient as we can be is the preferred, but one thing that did come up in our discussions is the importance for as much as possible for it to be in-person dialogue, right? Particularly for, I think, the future fisheries version. I think we might be able to do some of the tool development a little bit more remotely, but I think it's really good to have those discussions about, I mean, it's a pretty big question, like what does success of fisheries look like in 10 years, right? And so there were comments from the group about trying to have those in person. Now, if we could have them as like a half-day thing, an association with a meeting where a lot of the challenge is, this is a pretty diverse group of people that we want in the room. And so, and the bigger challenge might be finding times when they're all available to be in a place, right? But these are the things that we want to work through over the next 6 months, so we have a clear plan at the retreat to put that together. I don't know if others have thoughts on that, if I answered that.
I agree that I think it would be really great to try to combine, particularly for workshop too. It would be, and I'm wondering if there's some way we could have maybe a representative or from each focus area to make sure that we're sharing information. Like getting that list of like the data that you want to collect and maybe model will be different than what we're thinking, but together it would be stronger, so.
Yeah, totally agree.
I think we're going last on 6, but the idea of startups, technology, the third and the fourth. So instead of a workshop, what was brought up was this idea of which happens all the time, not far from here, is this idea of reverse pitching. So so another thought was from the fishing person's perspective, a human centric versus I'm talking to the fisherman for bycatch, I'm talking to the fisherman because of computer vision and maybe they can use it. But instead of you take it from a fishing person's perspective, human centric, it's probably hits economic empowerment, lack of financing. So the idea of like a reverse pitch, well, what does the fishing vessel of the future look like with prize money? So then you try and capture much larger than just trying to put tech onto the fishing community, but as well as like maybe the fintech crowd, maybe the business schools will participate and figure out new financing structures for these old decrepit vessels that are not getting financed, or advanced manufacturing for spare parts, 3D printing. So that came up in our thought was instead of a workshop, more of like a pitching program. Also creating, and that also creates awareness.
Yeah, I got really excited about that first deliverable. I know we're on time, but I think that the first thing was like kind of in the same sense, and sounds like focus area 2 of like what the heck's biodiversity, right? like what does success look like for future fisheries? We don't, it's one thing to say that. I admit when I was putting this together initially last year, I'm thinking like sustaining the fishing activity that's going on now in a way, right? We have a really good sustainable fishing model that's in place along the East Coast. How do we sustain that? But maybe it's how do we grow it? How do we, right? So those kinds of conversations, bringing in people that, and this list probably isn't even comprehensive of what you all think could be added. So let's think together on how to do that effectively.
Great. Thank you very much. Before, grab the clicker and click away.
So I think I'll start without the slide. 3 things that I've been thinking about. One is how do we start with equity in our education and training pieces and throughout the entire motion effort. And getting into the second slide is, how do we define equity? We're all in a different space in our head of what we think about that. What is our vision of that? And I think there's going to be a workshop about the vision of what that world looks like with an equitable workforce. The second was coming out, and Mark might talk more about it. Like, what do we mean by the innovation economy? What do you mean by innovation? And how is that also integrated into the educational programming as part of that thinking? And I don't have an answer to that one. And the last one is, I think that we, really got hit on the workforce numbers, and we have no answer yet as of yesterday. We're not doing it. Mark's not doing it. I don't think the aquarium's doing it. So that's still out there. I just wanted to put that out there before we start getting into details of this. This is really equitable education training. We can do some really excellent stuff across motion, but it's not getting 10,000 jobs. It's going to get 10,000 jobs in 5 years or 10 years, but not in 2 anyway. So one of the things that we found is that there are a lot of education and training programs and activities and opportunities, and it's a mess. It's all over the place. No one can know where to go. No one even knows that they want to go. And so there has to be some kind of a map, and a map doesn't exist and then be done. It's in a growing thing. It has to continue to evolve and live. But it would be great to get something, scoped out something within 2 years that looks like a pathway map, something like NYSERDA's thing, that says there's these things and there's some gaps. So some opportunities to go in different ways, and realizing that students, people, go in many different pathways. And it's not a pipeline. It is multiple pathways coming back again at different times, in and out of offshore wind. It's all part of STEM. It's all part of engineering and other design and many other things. So we have to sort of have a common understanding of that, but also sort of provide a map. It's really important to have pilot projects that are excellent, really, really high quality for the proposal, the type 2 proposal, to say, we know how to do equitable workforce education and training programs. And there's not an infinite number of these things. We're going to do 3 to 5 that we can do really, really well, and then scale across motion in a type 2 project. And so we have to get some examples, and it's not going to be everything, but we have to get a lot of more of the programs coming out of motion and one partner removed from the people in the room, to see what is out there. And then kind of this group must select in 2 years, 3 to 5 examples that might be included in our proposal. It's really important, and to get data. So Josh had his data hat on, said data, but to get an evaluation of those things. Why are they excellent? Why do we know they're going to work? What context do they work and can be replicable? And there's all kinds of examples that we have up here. Micro-credentials is an interesting collaboration between industry and academia that doesn't depend on a long-term approval of an academic program. And the future of education is not in 4-year degrees and graduate degrees. It's in much more flexible, accommodating and student-centered learning modes. And so, and this can't be done by one place. It's got to be done by the ecosystem, because there's expertise all over the place and the students are everywhere. And we need to meet students where they are. And so what is that model? How does it look in different places? How do we set up the network of folks? And I really need Jen yesterday, but we'll talk today. Couple examples that are happening that we talked about yesterday is, one is that the Marine Technological Society, which is an international society, has a grant, and they're doing some micro-credentialing offshore wind, micro-credentialing, and we'll do an offshore wind. And UMass Boston and Avangrid have begun conversations, and we'll get Jen going and other folks, community colleges and everybody, but into offering offshore wind micro-credentials, and as an example pilot to see what it can do. And I was thinking, like, if you stack 8 of these 6-hour experiences, that's pretty good to do 2 times 4 of each of the focus areas or something. It'd be pretty cool. We get an introduction to motion as one of the micro-credential units. Anyway, a lot of potential partners. It's a lot of potential activities. It's kind of infinite. And it's like saying, let's do science, let's do education, right? And so who's in and who's out, and that's that vision and definition of what's in motion. And we all have subsets and Venn diagrams that are overlapping. And we can't do it all, but what are we going to focus on in a type 2 proposal? Who are the key partners and who are the secondary sort of partners? What are the communities that we're going to use as pilots and examples? And how do what does that map sort of look like? We need to get some pilot programs and convergent projects going. So it's just like the other groups, we should write some proposals and hopefully get some funded and actually have a pilot project in a place like New Bedford that says, look, we have experience doing this and we're going to replicate this across motion in a type 2. We need, to do all the stuff, commitments from partners, what's in, what's out, what do we need, and cost and scale to write a proposal. So I'll pause there and see what you have any reactions, questions, thoughts. 2 years is really a short time. We're already 3 days in, it's too late. So we're proposing, everyone wants workshops, but we're proposing 2 in the first 6 months. The first one is, equity means something different to everybody. everyone is on a different path of learning and thinking. And so it came out yesterday, you know, how does this make you feel? What does it look like? What does the room look like? What does the activity look like and feel like? How does it different than what it is today, what it has been in the past, and what it might be different in some other regions or other, you know, offshore wind ecosystem, not even offshore wind, STEM, anything. And I think that sort of visionary, and there's all kinds of different ways of getting at that, can help us. And the definition is going to be a living definition and personal to sort of everybody. But you know, what kinds of things are we going to do that are most effective first? And what kind of, and I call it training, but learning together, shared vision, development, do we have to do to sort of do that? And I think we can do some of those things in an early workshop. And I think that has to come first before we even think about a type 2 or how we work in a community or what activities we do. We have to think about what this piece is. Something we can do online. We can see what existing education training programs are related to offshore wind now, or what could be tweaked to offshore wind pieces. And there's a lot of really good programming, and there's a lot of leveraging of existing programs. So we just added a little evaluation piece, or we add an offshore wind component to a marine technological society thing, or a marine science thing, or a fisheries thing. We change it to nature inclusive design, or we change it to offshore wind, and add the 10% extra. It's really much easier. We talked a lot about who was missing from the room yesterday, and who do we need to engage to have those conversations and have that representation and voice and vision. And this in and out of motion, that's a hard thing to come up with. Where in my job of many hats is the motion work, and where does it overlap with other things I do, and what is separate? Like, that's fine, I can do this in this room, and I'm going to do this thing that's completely conflicting in another part with another hat. Fine, it's an institutional priority, it's something, this is a motion priority, and this gets to the core values that we've been talking about, trying to define: innovation, regional specific, equity-based, these kinds of things, nature inclusive. So who's missing? Who do we need to get in the room? And we're asking all of you to think about and send, you know, we'll poll all of you. How do we work together? Everyone has different preferences for community. We talked yesterday about email versus Slack versus in-person versus remote versus hybrid versus one-on-one. We had a great conversation at the Five Horses Tavern. That was very different conversation than anything possible during the day. And the learning was different. We all have different skills. We all have different work styles. They're all great and they're different. And we have to get to know each other and how we work together to optimize that. And what we're looking for is collective impact, not 5 things glued together to get 5 things. It's 5 things getting together, 5 people getting together get 10, right? So how do we optimize the small investments in time and money to get the collective impact, and where are those magic bullet points? So those 2 sort of engagement and poll is sort of remote or virtual, or we can do sort of online and other things. The second one that would come in summer, before June, after June, at June, is a strategic planning kind of a thing. What are the key barriers to success that we'd have to overcome in the following 18 months to get to a type 2, one of them being like workforce development of thousands of jobs. Seems like we've heard there's no demand for jobs, which is not what we know is coming from the unions, from the people that are saying that all the riches are in the Northeast. The industry is thinking this, like, where are the jobs? What are the jobs? And what are the gaps in training with that map that we have to identify? That's a big thing to talk about. And then, you know, if we're going to do a pilot in, for example, New Bedford, which is sort of a leading example, how do we start designing that? And what does it look like? What's the vision sort of for that? And really, really important in the next couple of months is getting you all excited and getting our potential partners excited. Like, if we have a key person we want to engage, get them excited to join us. And then we can use that momentum to propel ourselves for 2 years. You done?
slide in the aquarium.
So we did not plan to both wear purple today. This is just coincidence. But we're sort of in our team purple. I know, right? We're synced up. All right, so Michelle, you did most of the talk. Oh, we did the first slide? All right, all right. So thanks for everybody yesterday who participated, and James, Joe Downing was in the room. It was terrific to have his participation. He had some really, really thoughtful additions that we've included in here too, which is great. So 7 big deliverables, and I think that we tried to frame them in a way that was specific enough to have something to tackle, but also I think with enough flexibility that we can move things along. I think we see big questions in what the new blue economy means and what outreach means. These are really nebulous terms, and we were just starting to sort of wrestle with those yesterday, and we'll be doing that more in the next several months. So as I go through these, sort of take all of that with a grain of salt, that things are going to move. As we're talking about, like, what does biodiversity mean? What does future fisheries mean? We have the same sort of, big questions in our mind too about what the new blue economy means. Even if we want to call it new blue economy, we actually had a really good discussion yesterday about whether we should be calling it the blue innovation economy or ocean climate or other things. And so I think that'll be part of our conversation over the next several months as well, as we try to figure out what the right nomenclature is. So big goals and deliverables. 1, establish objectives for the new blue economy outreach, including identification of specific blue economy and outreach initiatives to develop and explore, which sounds like we don't know yet, I think is what's going on here. It is sort of a, we are hoping in the next 6 months or so to really sort of nail down what we want to be able to do, because the blue economy is so vast. And as we're thinking about offshore wind and nature inclusive, what subset are we actually going to want to promote, and what audiences are those going to be directed at? When we say sort of, the aquarium often works with the public, right? But are we thinking about students? Are we thinking about an adult population? Are we thinking about workforce? And so really trying to narrow those and then develop initiatives around them. So that's why 1 is sort of a little vague. 2, new partnerships and development related to outreach aspects of the new blue economy. We're thinking about industry, startups, small businesses, offshore wind, enabling tech, government. We have some of those partnerships already in development. And I think what we're going to be doing is really creating a much more complete list and deepening those partnerships by the end of the grant. Participation in blue economy related workshops. I think that's something that we're already doing in lots of ways. We'll just continue with that work, which is funded not necessarily through motion, but we'll be capturing it as part of our motion deliverables. Publish report or section report on the new blue economy and offshore wind in New England. I think that this is something that we're going to be, depending on what we see the ultimate deliverable for this grant looking like, we could see a section of that report. We could also do something independently. Also an op-ed or similar through the aquarium PR efforts. One of the things that the aquarium is pleased to have is a fairly robust marketing communications program. And we'll be thinking about how to leverage that effectively to be either working, doing something with the Globe or with, the Times or the Journal or something else like that. Strategically, how we're going to use those angles to be able to promote nature inclusive design and offshore wind thoughtfully and responsibly too. I think that's something that we are always careful to talk about, that, we believe in the promise of that, but full-throated endorsement is not where we go. We have to be careful about that in everything that we do. And I know I'm talking to the right audience about that, but I just want to sort of add that caveat. With others in motion, assist in developing a strategy for data to be easily accessible, interpreted, understandable by non-scientific audiences. This is going to be a biggie, I think, for all of us. And in Dan's section, we talked about it. I see Colleen nodding her head too. I don't think there's going to be necessarily a unified approach, but I think one of the things that I'm hoping that, especially through TREAT, that we start really thinking about what data do we need, why, and for what audiences, because we want to work with our industry collaborators here. This is a very unique type of I suppose, sort of niche in that it's not sort of strict science, it's science with industry. So we need to think about that in the beginning, so that we have our partners comfortable and we know sort of where the meets and bounds are, where their comfort levels are. So we're excited about that, but we know that's going to be a toughie. And then workshop for New Blue Economy is part of a culminating symposium. Dan mentioned this, maybe something in DC at the end of 25 or something like that. We see a lot of value in that for the aquarium's perspective, especially for the ability to invite some of our friends from different federal agencies who aren't necessarily talking to each other, who can't. And we think that, being part of a larger workshop might be something that would fit well with sort of the aquarium's goals, and also being able to promote the New Blue Economy, or whatever we end up calling it, I think is something that also might get maybe others who would be interested in nature inclusive design even more interested in coming to this, because certainly it's a term that gets bandied about a lot in different federal agencies. So we see that as an attractor for the symposium. So those are the 7. I know I talk fast. I'm sorry about that. Any questions about this slide before we move to the next one? Okay.
So the next 6 months, we're gonna be developing a working definition of New Blue Economy, because can be a confusing term. Emily mentioned we might not even call it that. There was some talk about what the blue economy is and how the new blue economy is really the expanded one, or the future one, or innovation economy, all of those things. And we really need that to start from a shared understanding, so we can talk about what we're gonna do and figure out what we're not gonna do as well. We're gonna begin to identify audiences and pathways for outreach, and figure out what levels of engagement are needed and from who. I think we talked about being the aquarium and what kinds of outreach we can do. Also, there's a lot of overlap with workforce development and the technology community as well. And then at the aquarium, we also overlap with some of the decision makers, the state decision makers. And so figuring out those different audiences and how to reach them. We're gonna assemble existing resources, so videos, things to read, sort of basic terminology for outreach audiences to become literate or educated on the New Blue Economy. So this came from a idea that came from Joe Downing. He talked about computer literacy and having some kind of like a courses or a curriculum for that. So that was a really interesting idea. We felt like we could look at what was out there already, things that have been done that would be good resources for people that we could put on the Motion website or our website and point to different places for those. We're gonna participate in conferences like the other focus areas, join Oceantic, which is the business community for outreach and also making connections. And then identify specific blue economy and outreach initiatives to develop. So not really sure what those will be yet, but we'll start figuring those out before the retreat. Anyone in our group that wants to add anything else? Actually see anyone that was there.
I know Chris Swain was great yesterday to see online. Oh, sorry, Jeff Swain, and I think especially when we're talking about the definition of a new blue economy and thinking about, his point was really great about thinking about where equity or inclusivity fits into that there's a unique opportunity here to be talking about not just sustainability, but equity in this, and thinking about how, seriously, how to actually incorporate that and what does that look like. And so I think that's going to be a place where we're going to be doing some interesting, some more work on that as well. So it was a really good conversation.
Questions or comments? Thank you. We're gonna finish strong here.
So ours was on six was titled the workforce development around innovation. So it's not what it isn't is traditional workforce development. We all know we need more welders and all the trades. This also is based on very similar to our partner, the New England Aquarium, Michelle and Emily, on what is the workforce of the future look like for offshore wind and topics around biodiversity tied to innovation. So we see startups, See Ahead, for those who are not familiar with See Ahead, we're about 5 years old now. With the New England Aquarium, we started the first dedicated ocean incubator in the Northeast or east of the Mississippi, east of I-5. Well, the ocean is not an afterthought. So we see startups coming in, including from Tufts University, all over the country, the world. So the first thing, very much overlapping with focus area 5, is defining what the new economy is around offshore wind and biodiversity. So first feedback was we need a vision. So the vision is from an innovation perspective, STEM-based innovation. How can our future offshore wind sector be less impactful? There was a comment about we're going to build all these offshore wind turbines and we're going to have 500 more diesel engines running in and out of our ports. That doesn't make any sense, right? So that it overlaps with clean tech, electrification. Of course, there's impact on the community from a equity, fairness perspective. Who bears the brunt of some of the industrial activities, and of course, the environment. The other is, which we've seen in the news, is how does innovation make offshore wind more efficient, higher bottom line, right? We've had a lot of bad news recently with projects that are underwater. So there's maybe a bigger push from industry now to innovate. And of course, biodiversity, and we want it to be more inclusive. Inclusive also includes where the ability of offshore wind in the future of tackling the rising income disparity. Boston is booming, but that's not an even boom, right? If the disparity in the US on income continues to widen, that includes Massachusetts. One thought, please replace New England with the Northeast for our friends in New Jersey and Delaware. So apologize, I missed doing that. So how do we in the Northeast become a center of excellence? And so one also input from this is version 2. There will be a version 3. So from the session was, let's use a design thinking process of defining what the new ocean offshore wind economy has. And I don't have the slide here, but we did pull up a slide about how we define it, at least on See Ahead. It's roughly around 6 topics. It's the idea of one is a supply chain and a value chain. Value chain is less of a term that's used. Value chain refers to more of the technology, smarter. That's advanced sensors, that's modeling, that's autonomous underwater vehicles. It's also taking a spatial approach. So one other input that was put out by a couple people was, it's a blank piece of paper. Let's see, let's not be constrained by existing paradigms. Let's not just think big, but think outside of the box, so to speak. So that one thought is taking a spatial approach. What does that mean? 100 miles off the coast, 100 miles inland, satellite imagery all the way down to imaging or best attempts to image at the bottom of the ocean floor. And in the middle of that epicenter is an urban city like Boston or any of the coastal cities off of I-95. And the idea there from a spatial approach is everything's interrelated. We see that from startups a lot. It's like, I can correlate and get data on anything. I don't care where my data sets are from USDA, NOAA. I just need a customer and a problem set. So that was a thought. It's just thinking outside of the box and think bigger. Also working with, of course, always continuously working with stakeholders, taking a very wide, inclusive, and almost everyone is a stakeholder by the way we define it from a spatial perspective. And specific activities, though, in the next 6 months is really just getting voice of the customer. Who's the customer? The customer is industry. The customer is the public sector, not just the federal, but we talked about this yesterday as well. It's state, there's municipalities, and in the middle, there's economic development agencies, as well as county driven. And of course, there's community. So and I won't dwell too much on this, Josh, I mentioned it in yours, and ours was, instead of doing a session, but it is like a session, but is instead around open innovation. How do we pull in what our respective ecosystems are really good at, from tech, material science, and connect it better to what we say, what's on the coast, which would be represented by, let's say, Woods Hole and the marine science, and including the finance community. How do we together create more awareness? And one method of doing that, which is done very commonly here, like let's say at Greentown Labs, and we do it as well, is this idea of a reverse pitch. Here's a problem set. You got 6 months. There's a prize money. From a human-centric perspective, maybe from the fishing person's perspective, who can help tackle the 3 to 4 or 5 biggest, hairiest problems for the future of fisheries? And the thought there is maybe we start with the working fishing boat of the future. So that could take in also advanced manufacturing. Okay, so what are the specific activities? As I mentioned, the voice of the customer. I think I'll just summarize by saying we at See Ahead, we're 5.5 years old. We're growing, we're expanding. Our platform continues to get bigger. It's a global platform, so we were more than happy to support all the focus area groups and bringing our platform to bear. Continue to work with our partners, of course, in the aquarium. Item 6 is just a thought, is, under President Biden, it's unprecedented amount of funding that's going in, just IRA, tech hubs, or the CHIPS Act. It's very public, for example, that, which was very exciting, is that New Bedford and Commerce RI, which is the Providence MSA, has been shortlisted for the EDA Tech Hubs grant around blue tech. So just the thought is, one of the activities we should do in the next 6 months, just be aware of some of the federal grants that some of us in the room may be part of, and if not, as we look to widen the group of stakeholders, they're going to be working on that grants, and they're going to be providing vision. So at least we should know what the left hand is doing, because sometimes the left hand is doing more than one thing. And yeah, so I stop there for our item, and I just want to emphasize again, our topic was workforce of the future. So by focusing on the startups and the supply chain and the value chain, that'll flush out what we think is the workforce of the future. I'll give a simple anecdotal example. I was at East Boston talking to a very well-established tugboat operator. They've been family business, been here for over 100 years. And he made a comment, I don't need Mass Maritime to give me another deck officer. I don't need Mass Maritime to give me another engine officer. I need a digital officer. So that's what we're trying to flush out here.
Yeah, just to reiterate what you said with the future fisheries, I think there's some really cool overlap that we could do, and I wonder how we coordinate when that happens, like making sure we have active engagement with Focus Area 6 when we have that future fisheries workshop discussion, but then maybe the pitches come after that, because there might be some clarity that comes, we hope, from that workshop to identify where those pitch needs are.
Yeah, and just Nadia, like a reverse pitch in that process, that's a good amount of work. So that was suggested. So we may not end up doing that, but if it was a workshop where we've done this as well in the past, is then you can have startups, outside innovation, open innovation present, and they'll cover all the different. I got a diesel electric hybrid. I got a computer vision. We see all these. Something to tackle bycatch. Replace copper for the anti-fouling, and maybe in the manufacturing, etc. So we don't have to necessarily do it as reverse pitch. But the point was just an observation maybe from our platform is we see different entities have their own priorities. I want to tackle bycatch because my environmental group is, or I'm a clean tech crowd, and they all end up in front of that fishing community. And then they go, how do we deal with that? What we don't see is what someone else mentioned is a human-centric approach. It's like, well, what if the fishing person is the center? And then you look at it from that perspective. And then that's what we first heard was, well, if you ask the fishermen, they can't get financing for their vessels. And the price of fish goes like this, right? So maybe innovation could also be on the fintech side. So.
In terms of I heard you mention the digital officer yesterday too. Is that because so much of the instrumentation now coming on board new ships is digital? And they need sort of an integration for sort of local environmental awareness, or is it more like there's all these data sets out there, you know, weather, climate, stock assessment that I need to sort of like synthesize in some reasonable way in order to plan 3, 4, 5 down the, I don't know, like my question, like that digital officer, like what is that?
I think the answer to that, Matt, is yes.
Okay.
The both, but practically what I think we were standing on a bridge. So what I think he was referring to was, and he was flipping through the dog-eared logbook, saying this has to go away. The Coast Guard recognizes that. I'm waiting for dirty boots to land on the deck to do whatever they're going to do, and it's written. So one is compliance and the fact that the vessel itself is becoming more digital. The second aspect, which we see a lot of, which is not on the bridge necessarily, is ship routing, data analytics. We're seeing startups come from that as well, where that's more of a general operations of optimization. But the theme, which is applies to every other industry, right, is digitization. And the last point we made on the workforce of the future, which we referenced the UAW issue. The UAW, part of the stress that they're under and the strike they did was they're worried about that the car of the future only has 1/3 of the moving parts. It's a massive battery, a generator, a computer, software, and 4 wheels. It's a whole different skill set. So that same thesis is going to apply to the working waterfront likely.
We'll sneak in one more.
Yeah, just have you been to the Boston Seafood Show?
I have not flown up for that, but the team has. Yeah.
Yeah,
Our team
I
has.
just think in terms of, so there's the aspect of being on the water and at the docks, but then there's the other side of the fishing industry, which is their marketing and the products that they produce. And I think there's a lot of innovation in that side of things, and it might just be a good place to go to just see where things are at and get ideas and see what conversations are being had there. It's kind of a different side of things.
I'm more of a mechanical clean tech background, and our team, Luke, runs our seafood side. So Luke and the rest of the team we always go to that March event, and I'm always told to stay home for that one.
Thank you very much. Focus area leads for giving a great orientation to our next speaker. That's the only reason this all got done.
The one other thing that is not really reflected explicitly in here that occurred to me as I was listening to the working group's discussion is that I think one overall objective of our policy proposals will be to support a learning environment for this stuff, because we don't know everything yet, and we need to be able to invest and with flexibility, test things, take some risks. So I'll incorporate that in here more explicitly, but that was something else that the focus groups informed me of. Okay, so first objective for 2-year objective is to develop a policy framework for nature inclusive offshore wind farms. And this will include a lot of the work that was mentioned or be supported by the ocean science and blue tech and future fisheries discussions. But we want to have, and I use the word framework, not full baked proposals, nothing explicit, but we want to be at a point where we have a sense of direction and a sense of energy towards some goals. We want to be able to present this at the DC Symposium and also market and distribute it widely, either before or after the symposium, as a continuing engagement with stakeholders. We want to establish motion as an acknowledged thought leader and visionary collaborator, and a hub for this kind of conversation and a safe place to hold conversations and initiatives that operate across sectors. And we also, and this is focusing on the US and translating experiences that are happening globally to the US context. And that will take adaptation. We've learned that across the board in offshore wind. You don't just import the way things are done, but you absolutely have to learn from them. And we want to be a partner in the larger global network that's advancing this. We want to create a lot of robust alliances, but we want to call out a robust alliance with fisheries and other marine use industries. Again, because this is something we believe that we're adding to the conversation to biodiversity. And I was really happy to hear Colleen's summary of the ocean science taking a broader definition of biodiversity that can have indicators or targets that have a variety of different objectives. So we really need to bring in the industry in that to that discussion fully. We want to identify regional impact targets for nature inclusive design because that will help shape the policy that's needed to move in that direction. Again, this is work based on the work in the working groups, the technical work in the working groups, and translating those into policy proposals, and also identifying associated regional targets for commercialization towards those objectives in nature inclusive design to sort of address one of the weaknesses that was seen in our the big NSF proposal, that we didn't have clear enough pathways to that kind of innovation and large scale development of new companies. And again, that's based on the work that's happening in the focus areas. Can I have the next slide? So, not that slide. There we go. So for the next 6 months, again, we really took a deep breath and tried to be realistic. So a lot of these things that you'll see were not modified with words like preliminary and draft before. We don't have that much time. We do have a lot of information existing, and I think the challenge for in preparing for the retreat is to put it in a format where people can digest it, where it can be made meaningful. Things like the regulatory programs and incentives and policy directives in other countries. We need to, tease out features and themes and be able to discuss it. We have the information. We need to do a little bit of analysis and packaging, but we need a mapping of programs here in the US and introduce ourselves to those entities. In order to know who our partners can be and make sure we're not duplicating and really leveraging things that are already happening. We need to identify individual champions of nature inclusive design within the industry and regulatory community. Starting that outreach over the next 6 months to find out who's already on our team or who might be thinking this way within all those other initiatives. We're just individuals within agencies that folks in the room might know of who you think would be particularly interested. We want to connect with those folks and bring them in right away to help advise us on how to think about outreach and larger engagement with their sectors, regulatory sectors, industry sectors. We want to, as a next step, develop a draft sector-based survey approach for broader input. So how do we want to go out to the broader fisheries policymakers, offshore wind industry that we're not already connected to, that might be more skeptical, that might not have a natural affinity for the work we're doing. We need to understand their perspectives and concerns, and we need a way to go after that in an efficient process. And this is really what I started talking about in the beginning, developing a draft state of the practice document benchmarking global policy approaches. So we want to look at what's out there and digest it and put it in a form that we'll be able to discuss at the retreat. And as part of that discussion, thinking about the US where we don't have explicit policies, coalesce and present the information that has taken place in a variety of discussions here and at the Roger Williams event. What do we know are the barriers? What are the obvious problems or pain points, as Atma put it yesterday? Include that in that discussion. Because all these things are so integrated, we need to establish effective communication flows across motion working groups or focused areas. I think we need to just have some methods for making sure everybody's informed about what everyone else is doing, and where there's synergies or efficiencies, we can capture those. So give a little thought to that. And then this last bullet is sort of the product of that discussion, that values discussion. We spent a lot of time on this and it was really great. We need to create a draft motion communication plan for consistent delivery of key messaging. So defining of terms, some of those terms that we were talking about this morning. And articulate a clear vision, just to make sure. So this, the larger bullet here was part of the initial take. And my thought on this was really we just want to have our talking points and be consistent across our messaging and our definitions as we go forward. But we got a little bit deeper into it and a number of different angles came up. And I really appreciate the addition of this concept of storytelling. How do we reach people? We give information, we give data, we can give visuals, but we really need to think about storytelling that can make the vision of motion tangible, emotional, inspirational. We need to figure out how to include climate change in our whole story, since again, that's the root of why we're pursuing this offshore wind enterprise. And I think we need to think about that across all the working groups. Where does the impact of climate change from a science perspective, from a fisheries perspective, where does that fit in? We need to be able to respond to ways stakeholders are hearing the story of offshore wind and do that with empathy and address those concerns. And a great example that Mike Pohl gave is that although he hasn't heard this explicitly, he can imagine, and I would agree with him, that people are looking at this saying that, offshore wind, and then we have offshore wind, and then we're talking about co-locating other things. And what we're really doing is taming the wild ocean. And I think that's really a very likely challenge. And we've heard words to that, the pristine ocean, we're industrializing the ocean. We need to think about how we embrace that perspective and respond to it effectively, and think about other ways people might be looking at this that are bringing reactions that are not positive. We need to identify key audiences, including all the decision makers, the agency leadership, regulators, elected officials. Eventually, our communication plan, maybe after 2 years, will be in part a lobbying plan. How will we affect these changes? How will we support that happening? Right now, we need to focus on just identifying who the players are. What are those key points? Who are we going to need on board eventually to get this stuff done? The suggestion was made that we should include message testing for different audiences, so that while we do need to make sure we're consistent in the content that we're delivering, we want to make sure we're delivering it in the ways that different audiences can hear it effectively. And actually doing some focus groups or testing with maybe some of the key allies that we identify will help us understand particular sensitivities within different groups that we need to address. And we need to include opportunities for outreach on multiple platforms. A lot of that was discussed, and just make sure we're organized about that and leveraging the work that individuals are doing and being efficient and clear about that. And that includes participating in events, hosting workshops, and also things like op-eds, more direct outreach. And I think that was reflected in Dan's presentation this morning from his focus area. So that's what we have. And I don't know, is there time for question or did I go over? Any comments?
We're set, but thank you very much, Farah.
Okay, thank you.
Move on to project goal 2. Yes.
So the really cool thing about motion is that it's expansive. It can touch almost any part of the world. It can touch almost any part of the population. I mean, because energy's common, all that good stuff. So I think the real opportunity for us with motion, and we tried to capture in this set of goals, and my hat's off to all of the people that are in the room with me. Everyone will raise your hand if you're in the room with us, because you're actually, this is really hopefully capturing your thoughts, is to really start off with, and you've heard this in other places, with a vision, where the vision is not just expansive, but it's selective, and that the vision is based on people and not just technologies and problems in science. Because in the end, what matters is what is the impact that we're having on the communities, on the people that we're actually trying to impact. So starting off with, who are we trying to impact with motion? And that people set that we're talking about includes then the local stakeholders, right? The local communities. It includes people across all incomes, right? So it's not just the people who go to college, not just the people who go to PhDs. It includes the people who are in the communities and who have to transform themselves because one industry is morphing into a new industry. How do we help them through? So it's across income, it's across skills, it's across communities. And it's really important for us to think about them because across all our work, in the end, that's what it should be impacting. It also gives us an opportunity to think about, given those community people that we're trying to impact, where are the gaps in innovation? Mark and I had a fun thing about thinking about, are they incremental things, right? There's also incremental ways you can improve what you have, but what are the big step changes we might make that actually allow us to leapfrog what other people are doing in nature-inspired design in Europe and other places that may be ahead of us? Take advantage of the community of innovation that we have in this whole region to really take us and push us up to another level. And then finally, really understand not only why we need this innovation, but why us? Why motion? Why are we uniquely positioned to make this all happen? And I think this is where it really comes to the point of really identifying who is the cluster of people we're trying to impact, who are the right people we need to bring in the room to make this happen, how will we measure our success? Really identifying upfront. So the upfront metric should include not only the hard quantified things like how many jobs do we create, et cetera, but also the emotional and the social pieces. How do we want people to feel about motion? How do we want to feel about the emotion, not only in the communities, they want to feel pride in the community. Some of you heard John Mitchell's famous quote. We were in a meeting with John when I first met him, and he said, I want to turn New Bedford into a town of strong shoulders to a town of strong brains. That's emotional. And that really is what his metric of success is. And I think it's a great one. It's a great way to think about the impact we want to have. In this innovation ecosystem, well, some of the ideas got thrown around. There's always this gap between ideas and actually implementing them. And oftentimes, as you get to cross that gap, then you have great incubators like what Blue Swell is doing and others. But before that, you need a playpen. You need a place to try things out where people can talk about ideas and needs. This is Mark's earlier comment around doing reverse pitching. And people who have ideas how to solve it, but you need a place to test it. To just try it out and show someone in some limited kind of way that you can actually solve a problem for them. So it might be cool to think about motion having a sandbox. It's on a motion sandbox where you can basically pilot, try, experiment. Anyone in the community can do it without a lot of overhead. And it's a way of demonstrating not only technology, but maybe policy changes. Maybe there are policy, social policies or economic things that you want to try as well. It's the same concept of doing experiments, an experimental approach, as opposed to trying to think everything through before you try anything. So it's what Greg was referring to. It's let's just try. A lot of things fail. In life in general, experiments often work out best. So that was the innovation ecosystem, and the economic one in many ways mirrors a similar kind of thing. So the ideas are very overlapping, but it's a slightly different twist in the sense that the economic one, we once again want to set the vision. Here, I'm a big fan of John Carter. People know about John Carter. So Carter has written a series of things around, what do you do in a crisis? How do you really transform organizations, turn them upside down? And it starts with have a crisis. And it's almost like, what's the crisis that Ocean's trying to solve, right? And maybe that's what we need. We need to start with, what's the crisis we're trying to solve? There's so many ways in terms of the economic development, right? And once again, establish then who are we trying to help with that crisis? Because that'll help us focus and prioritize where we can be most effective with our programming and what we have to do to pilot and how we want to pilot to scale. And then that includes identifying all the right people to really address that crisis. And the interesting thing to me when I was listening to the conversation is it's multi-level. It's the cities, it's the regions, it's the states, it's the federal, it's both industry as well as government. So there's many parts, and we could get overwhelmed. But if the rallying thing is, how do we solve this crisis? That may help us figure out that who do we need to connect with?
I know this is unconventional, but can I ask a question?
Yeah,
Kevin?
sure.
What is the crisis?
Well, that's a good question. Well, in this one, let me try one out.
Yeah.
I think a crisis, and this is, I'm going to paraphrase John Mitchell a little bit. We are doing this energy transformation because as a society, we need to get off fossil fuels, but we're going to actually drag down all the coastal communities as we transform our energy system. And unless we do something proactive, we're going to miss an opportunity to capture the capacity and capabilities of a whole set of people who are in those communities today who could help us through this transition in multiple levels. And if we don't do it consciously, we'll end up with inefficiencies across the board and actually people failing.
So that's the crisis, is not doing it consciously.
Yeah.
If this is left to whatever its own devices, it will not happen. It's the consciousness of what we need to do.
Yeah. And I would add that it not only will it just not happen, it's going to happen in a way that people are going to be able to pick at, be able to say, this doesn't work, let's not do it. Or, this whole nature expired stuff costs too much. Let's just go back to getting stuff into the sea. Yeah. So I really think there's an opportunity here, though, to be clear. And I think Farah picked up on this. It is storytelling. It is being very clear. But I really think getting to the emotional reason for doing this is really a way to bring people on board. I am impressed with the amount of talent that I've met through this motion project. I'm not a wind energy kind of guy, and we're putting together a type 2. It's just like the depth of talent we have here I would love to see a way to leverage that in a very focused way, and I think that's what the government wants. I really think that NSF and other people want to show the taxpayers, us, that we can actually be the master of our own transformation. So anyway, just once again, mirroring the other things, you clearly have to set up the measure of success here. And clearly with economic development, it becomes even more important to think about the total population you're trying to help. Not just the college graduates, not just getting more people in the STEM, but also people who are at later stages in their life. And yet they need to make that transformation. This is the people, who GM, who are sitting there saying, hey, we're not going to make internal combustion engines anymore. Do I have a job? Well, I know people talk about retraining. That's hard, right? But how do you actually help those people? You can't just wipe them out and say, oh, no, you don't have a job anymore in the next 20 years. My father was a linotype operator. Anyone here know what linotype is? They used to print books by casting whole lines of type. It was a metal process. Once digital printing came out, his job was gone. And yeah, he went through retraining. He went and learned how digital stuff. But who wants to hire a 55-year-old digital guy when they can hire a 22-year-old digital person? So there's a whole kinds of translations that have to happen here as well. It's the same things will happen across the board. And then finally, there was a lot of good discussion around really running an economic white paper. Once again, getting at this crisis thing, what's the economic problem we're trying to solve here? And it's part of that, and Dan educated me on this. Today, the way the permits are all written and the RFPs are written is 20-year service. Lowest cost of energy for 20 years of service. And if you look at it only through that lens, then you don't capture the opportunity to actually do things up front that will allow you to have 50 years of service or 100 years of service, 2 years of service. This is the whole concrete monopile idea. So it's really writing that paper then to really make the argument that the best way to address this crisis is by changing the economic model and the way we think about it, so you can justify other types of investments. And then finally, it's really important for us to think about what are the key pilots that we can do to demonstrate these concepts in advance of writing the next type 2. I think some other people alluded to this as well. We have to be able to not just talk about it in the next proposal. They clearly want to see evidence of having already done experiments to prove that what the type 2 is really doing is allowing us to scale as opposed to just discover. So in the next several months, it kind of buckets up into 3 areas, and this might be a little broad, but certainly there's a lot of work that we can do up front just to try and figure out what is the space that we're operating, who are we operating in, and all that good stuff. There was actually a very strong interest in doing site visits. You know, it was Bob who said, "Hey, let's go out on a boat," and Tom said, "You got 4 days." But you know, it would be good to see things up front, just give you a different sense of, and go into the communities. I learned so much going down to New Bedford, meeting with John, and going out on the boat into the harbor. Those little things go a long way to kind of building context. Tom and I had a great conversation around, you know, I didn't even know about Rhoda, right? So I think there's all kinds of ways to build perspective within the group that really help going into that workshop in the summer. And then the third thing was just do some strong man white papers. Just sketch out some ideas that you can bring then to the workshop in the summer. That we help prime the conversation, potentially flesh them out. So did I miss anything for those of you in the room? That's better. Thank you. Okay. More estimates.
It's been fantastic, first of all, to see from the reporting from the focus area groups. And, you know, Josh sort of mentioned this very directly, but the discussion really helped to focus and come up with some things that are really credible and possible to do. I think, you know, when we think about what the goals are, we have these focus areas and they are on sort of more specific topics. But all the focus areas in the work, how are they contributing to the goals? And so for those people who weren't people who filled out these detailed templates, one of the things we had asked all the focus area leads to do was to, after thinking of all things could be done, what's our strategic plan? What questions do we think we can answer, et cetera? They were then also asked to, well, how can this work in this focus area contribute to a goal, to one of the 3 goals that we defined? And so Farah and Kevin have talked about the goals for policy and regulatory type frameworks. And I know they had a great discussion, as Kevin's group also had a great discussion. So thank you very much for both of your dynamic presentations. I'm going to talk about the 3rd goal, which relates to a test bed. And I want to start with a definition and sort of go through this sentence by sentence. So a test bed is a platform for conducting rigorous, transparent, and replicable testing of scientific theories or hypotheses, computing tools, and new technologies. Okay, yeah, that's a Wikipedia definition. Fairly clear, sounds fairly comprehensive in terms of how it was characterized. And when we think about this, you know, what this platform is, it includes the ability to compare the efficacy of competing technologies. Yeah, validate one technology with another. Generally speaking, these are physical, laboratory and field work, but they could be analysis platforms. And in the area of offshore wind energy, we commonly know that there's so many complex things to in fact actually model, you know, hydrodynamics, aerodynamics, structural dynamics, the condition of the seabed. Then that's before we get into anything to do with these ecological models that are also very relevant. So how do we take complex models and analysis methods and see if we can have more simplified tools that do a decent enough job of making good predictions that we can be approaching it more holistically? So there are a lot of analysis methods in which people do this comparison of one computational model with another related to efficiency and system level approaches in supporting them. So I've given an example here of a test bed field assessment. Outside the area of motion is the comparative assessment of LiDAR systems using anemometers on Met towers. And people have been working in this space for a long time. Advancements in LiDAR have been absolutely amazing. People can do it less cost effectively, more cost effectively than building Met towers, gather much more data. And it's been a struggle to get the regulatory bodies to, in fact, actually, and the other bankers and the underwriters and everybody else to accept that you're going to use a new technology over one that has been used for many decades. And so when we think about what a test bed is aiming to achieve, it's not just, hey, great for the academic community, for some industry, et cetera, but we want it to a test bed to be actually of the level that it enables a change in regulatory and certification type practices. And then we ended up talking about several different things and all of the challenges when we think about building a test bed. And I really like Farah's comment in goal 1 related to values, because we actually talked quite a bit about values. Like, why are we doing this? We're not doing this to, launch a startup that makes an enormous amount of money or anything, yes, those things are what we expect to be offshoots and associated with many of the things that we do. But it's like, how do we as a broad community with a spectrum of scientists and representations from stakeholders, et cetera, how do we ensure that the products of what we do are actually served to best advanced models, advanced responsible design, consider the needs of communities, and how do we do this regionally, nationally, and globally, and how do we all work together? So we had a good sort of broad discussion. And, there is a lot of concern in test beds about the misinterpretation or misuse of data. I always use the same example from my concrete knowledge from sitting in code committees when we removed the part of the code that says you can check the adequacy of a concrete structure by measuring the crack width. Because we really don't understand the impact of crack width on durability that well. We can't actually predict crack widths very well. And if you have it in a code, any lawyer can grab a crack width gauge, take it up to a structure and say you're deficient, right? So there is concern in how we run test beds so that it doesn't end up, in fact, disadvantaging the industry. So we spoke about the motivation of these, which are a lot of them are scientific and multi-objective. Projects are always on tight timelines, cost and funding. And I already mentioned this issues associated with what a test bed is it's helping to set, be of a high enough level that we can change regulations and how we do certification. And we have to be risk sensitive to these matters. Of course, there's two things that we did, right? What are sort of the broader goals over 2 years? And then what are some specific things that we can get underway? And in it, I'll read the first little bit and then I'll comment. So what are the examples of test beds that we want to create over the next 2 years? And this is really what we want to do depends on what the focus area groups do and what pilot projects we get underway, right? That's defining the scope of work. But where the test bed comes onto it is the test bed says, okay, you're doing this work, but let's make sure that when you're designing the sensing systems and you're thinking about the metadata and how we are doing reporting it, we are doing it in a way that's up to a higher level that it could actually be considered a test bed that people can use and change practices based on what is learned. So it wasn't really within our purview of our discussion to say that, oh, these are them. These are the specific test beds that we're going to create. No, those are, as people work in the focus areas and make certain advancements, let's look at then take the test bed lens into it and say, okay, what else do we need to incorporate to be successful? And so what are these types of test beds then? Well, some of them are going to relate to pilot projects that we can get underway in the next 2 years, or anticipated convergent projects for the next proposal that we submit, be that to NSF or be that to other types of organizations. Because I think there's a broad recognition of the importance that when research is done, the data is actually collected to make a difference. So we didn't get into the specifics of which theories, hypotheses, et cetera, to do. But on the more specific, the 6 months is, well, there are, and one of the reasons that earlier on, when I was reporting on focus area 1, I wanted to show the idea of a project that we think there's very good chance is going to get underway, where we put these structures into the water with different materials, geometries, and coatings and other types of things, and we want to learn from them. That we use that as an opportunity to look at it with the test bed lens and say, what is all the metadata? What are all the associated IP issues that we need concerned about? How do we publish this? How is this referenced? How is it sanctioned? How do we get the community to say this is something that people should be using? So I think so we spoke about 2 things when we were thinking of activities through June of 2024. Some of them going to be in support of these pilot projects and other ideas that get underway. And then the other one that I think actually spent most of our time talking about is test beds from like a framework type level. How does one think about approaching test beds, and what can we learn from what else has been done? And the idea of looking at performance in the field has been in offshore wind has been done for some long period of time in the research at Alpha Ventus. In the room at lunch, you can pick up their book, and there's a couple of pamphlets there in terms of some of the great work that they've been doing. You're probably aware that Tufts with URI and others have been doing structural health monitoring on the Block Island wind farm, as well as the coastal Virginia offshore wind. And Drew Carey, who was here yesterday, they and Inspire Environmental have done a lot of the work in assessing benthic conditions and environmental impact of Block Island and others. So there's been a lot of people involved in making measurements and then seeing how we use those measurements to be able to actually advance science and practice, et cetera. And I would say that when you go back and you look at a lot of these, even when a lot of effort went into it, sometimes they didn't necessarily achieve what they were set up to aim to do. So how do you make sure you have all the people in the room when defining what to measure and how the data is done so you actually achieve it? In the ocean test bed, and I'll just make reference to a document out there, this is something that there was a collaboration between WHOI and then Tufts and also UMass Dartmouth. It's always great to have Chen here during these discussions as well on ocean test beds. So that's a really nice document that talks about things that need to be done in that space. And I'll skip over that. Then the last thing that last 15 minutes of the conversation was more about how do we have a framework for test beds? And Jamie was telling us about the EcoShape Consortium. And this was presented when Farah and I as well were in the Netherlands. And the EcoShape Consortium book is out there, and I'll distribute it in an email. But what they do is they have very significant support by across the Netherlands by many different industries. And Jamie was saying, for example, at Boskalis, they have a full-time senior person plus other fees that they put into it. And what does this organization do? It anomalizes the data. It structures the data. It has expert view go in and it discusses that data, and then that data is available for everybody. And so this gets away from the barrier of even knowing necessarily which particular offshore wind project that this data in fact actually comes from. And they say that, and what she has seen evolve in this, and they have, a broad level of participation by many companies across the Netherlands. And they have a large number of people who've actually been heavily engaged in this. You'll find Jamie's name in that list. But it's an idea that they are actually bringing in quite a broad group of people that represent different interests across different technical fields, social fields, to look at data and figure out how we're going to provide in a way that is most helpful. So I think in terms of 6-month activities, we're going to look at the focus areas. What are you thinking about for possible pilot projects? And then if we look at that from the test bed lens, how does it change what you might do and who might be involved in those discussions? And then the other thing we're going to do as a next step is we're going to arrange a conference call with the folks who operate EcoShape in the Netherlands and learn a little bit from the models that they've taken, where they found and so we help adopt best practices, see where there might be opportunities for collaboration. So that is test beds. And checking my time because I'm on the agenda actually next as well as marketing and engagement. So I'll stop here for a moment and see if anybody has any comments and thoughts on what they heard. And Eric was in that discussion as well, and Colleen and Loretta. So please chime in on what you heard and some different additional thoughts. Eric, yes.
Dan, thank you for that summary and for the chance to weigh in. The ocean testbed itself has been this idea of a research station out in the ocean for the atmospheric, oceanic, biological, geological characteristics for resource characterization. We've been talking about that since about 2015. It's actually identified as a priority, as a project in the Energy Act of 2020 and was appropriated in the Jobs Act. And there's a very long-standing initiative between WHOI and UMass Dartmouth and Tufts and others to build this station. And this is the place where you can, the process of validating new technologies so that they're regulatable and bankable and insurable and litigable. And so I would also advocate that one of our near-term goals would be to connect the work that Motion is doing with the existing work that is going on the ocean testbed, and then to try to find a leadership structure to advance that, because everything's kind of stalled right now in terms of there's a community, but there's a lack of bandwidth. We also do have resources. And so to identify sort of bringing this together into one project. And so that's something I'd like to put on the table as something I hope we can do in the next 6 months.
And then just curious, the IRA NOAA resiliency grant. A lot of entities passed in that grant, it's just too big. So NOAA's had a lot of funding. So curious, any of the stakeholders you mentioned with the test bed maybe apply for that resiliency grant?
Well, I think the issue is that there's a community, but we haven't made it cohere and given it the room to pursue these things. And so right now we're actually looking for some professional level capacity to sort of lead these efforts and bring them together. And so what I'm advocating is that whatever Motion is thinking about doing, that there be a conversation with Woodsell Oceanographic and with UMass Dartmouth about, the existing ocean testbed conversation, and to see if we can pool the problem. I think the crisis, Kevin, is that we're sending out $1 million increments to hundreds of thousands of places, and they don't add up to be bigger than the sum of their parts. And so if we can take these parts and sort of convene them and say, who's going to lead this? And then what's going to happen? And then there's an aspect of it that is in the Motion mission, and there's an aspect of it that is in this other mission, and that these two worlds come together. If we could have the conversations that need to happen, and I think they could happen relatively quickly, then there can be a team that is focused on the testbed and sort of how it, in this case, how does it serve the interests of Motion?
Gosh.
Yeah, just to build on that, I totally agree. And there are other activities that are like that are happening in other states. Like state of New Jersey right now has a $25 million call out for a test bed. There's a team that's responding to that are some are in this room. And so I think it'd be good to coordinate those kinds of things. We've also had an engagement with a place where this has already been done in Spain. There's a group called Plocan. I don't know if you've seen that group, but they have a ocean-based test bed exactly for this purpose. They even have a turbine there that people can go use, but it's more general than offshore wind. That have been really good partners of ours for over a decade that could join this conversation too. They likely have some stories to share.
We recently had a very successful conversation between the New Jersey BPU and the Mass DOER about transmission. So there's an enormous level of goodwill and sympathy right now between the two states. And the LiDAR testing that Dan was talking about has been conducted by Anthony Korincich at WHOI on the ACIT tower. And there is an existing wind forecast improvement project. So I think to your point, Josh, if we could have a group in Motion sort of drawing the map of this and saying like what pieces that strategically, what pieces fit together, it would be, I would be very up for having that conversation with folks.
We could be so scarily efficient. Yeah.
That would be nice.
Yeah.
And then maybe there's a way for whatever's happening in New England, what's happening in New Jersey to be, constructed in a complementary way.
I'll sort of underline that a little bit, I think, because one of the things that it seems that like becoming clear to me, similar to what was in, I think Colleen's focus area, which was assembling sort of the academics, the NGOs, others who are sort of in this test bed world already. I think it really makes our region look very, very strong once we start to galvanize some of that information. And it's easy, a little bit easier said than done. I mean, speaking from experience at, Woods Hole, like we have general senses of what people are doing, but we don't actually have necessarily a point person who says, I am the person who knows, what all these 24 people are doing. But maybe with a little bit of legwork, we'll be able to establish something like that. So Motion might be a really good place for that. I could see that being beneficial, not just for the purposes of this grant, but also just for the community generally. I think it'd be really useful.
I wasn't in your breakout yesterday, and I might have missed it in what you said earlier, but I wonder if there's any space in the test bed goal framework for a social or a cultural test bed. And I think, and part of my brain is going there, of course, that's not my field of expertise. I would, it's really a social scientist question, but especially poignant were a number of the messages in Greg's talk earlier today about social license and cultural license and how that, fits in. And so I don't know if that it goes beyond the scope of what you guys are thinking about, but.
It is not something that we discussed, and I heard some talks given on trying to do sort of society assessments and how do you, it's complicated, and obviously you need people who have good trusted relationships even to begin some of those conversations. And I think, true to what is said, you want to be engaging with those who have already been starting to talk about those things and see what you can do to support what they're doing. But that has not been part of the discussion in the large proposal for this 10-year center. We got into some of those issues, and the full proposals like on our Motion website. But I think that, one of the things we want to do is continue that conversation. And, when you look at what people like Greg have accomplished, or I shouldn't say people like Greg, because Greg's probably unique. When you look at what Greg did, and it's just, it's just exceptional. And we have to be able to think about how we do this. I know I commented in one of the meetings, like a challenge with technology is it often disadvantages those who are already disadvantaged. And, the comment about, how far do people in some communities live by coal plants? And then how do we think about, well, if we're building hardened infrastructure on the coastline for ports and fabrication yards, like where are we going to put those? Right. So I think these need to be a very strong part of the conversation. This is not my area, but I think on the team, we had a very strong team, I would say, who is very learned, educated in working in these spaces. And I'm familiar with some other people across the nation who have been starting to do these types of studies. And it was very interesting at this IEA DOE event that was held out in Colorado. I think this was the February one last year. A lot of time was spent on feedback that you get from communities as people think about, okay, we got a lot of the technology things, we got supply chain and other issues, but like we have to do a better job of interfacing, because as these projects have become real, then we're starting to get more real feedback, and we have to figure out how to make it a win for everybody and do the learning that's needed to achieve that. So thanks for that.
I mean, to your point, like if you look at and what, environmental concern usually scales with income. The richer you are, the more you are environmentally concerned, especially with respect to climate. Once people have their basic needs met, they actually have enough time to actually think about what the future might be like in 10 years, rather than what it's going to be like tomorrow for them. And so in a sense, the project that we're dealing with here in terms of trading for carbon-free energy or carbon-reduced energy resonates mostly with people that have the luxury of sort of thinking on those scales, right? And so to your point about your dad, right, too, like I do think that the engagement activity has to be focused actually not on climate. If you're talking about the people that are, they're worried about the day-to-day environmental impact, like asthma, like that, you know what I mean? Like it's gonna be, like my experience is that the as you move down the income ladder, the concerns just become much more granular and very concrete day to day about how to just get through life, because it's just hard.
I have absolutely no idea how, like, you look at the mean household income in the US and it's like, my wife and I, we make good money and it's like, holy cow, there doesn't seem to be a heck of a lot left at the end of the year. This is a country where we have enormous income and wealth disparities, and hopefully we find ways for making the energy transition be as just as possible.
But like, you know, the point of like working with people in the ports and the micro-credentialing and all that sort of stuff, like I feel like that if you really made a focus on making their lives easier on a day-to-day scale, you know, how to improve it on the day-to-day. I mean, I think the climate cell is just a tough one. For people that are that are just going through that. And so, right. And so like, yes, this entire operation of building wind farms integrated over decades is a good move, right? I mean, it seems like that's a no brainer, but that's just not the scale in which most people live.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please. Bob and Mark, you go
Just,
first, and
you
Bob,
know,
and
Eric,
then we'll
a
move on.
crisis is that people are dying and people are getting sick from air pollution and from heat now in here and across the world. And so if we can make that better in particularly coastal communities, get rid of the coal fired plants, put in clean energy, give heat pumps that can cool them, that solves a day-to-day crisis, right? The other crisis is people being forced to move, climate migration, out of places that are getting flooded and places that are getting gentrified. And so if you can solve that, that addresses that as well. So the different, Ram Ramanathan gave a talk, he says, the COVID moment is coming where everyone or someone's neighbor is being affected by climate change. And it's always about health. Investments are made by health, not about climate change, long-term planning, these other things. It's about health.
Yeah.
So, but also Matt, to your, it was a fundraiser not far from here. Tesla's double parked around the corner. I won't name the environmental organization. It was during the Trump administration. They said, give me funding. I'm going down to do battle with the Trump administration on climate. And the first question came up was, I just came back from France. I was hanging out with the so-called yellow jackets. It's what your point is. And they're saying, you don't need to worry about climate change and I'm worried about income security. So what you reply to that? She had no answer, flat-footed. And meanwhile, Brayton Point is 40 miles away, where the last coal plant in the Northeast is now being converted into offshore wind erection, energy storage, good solid jobs that are not just for PhDs. That the answer was in front of her. But what threw me was like it was almost like two different bubbles, even though they're only 40-mile distance. So it goes back to I think that is two things: is the messaging, and that this is for everyone. Everyone has a potential here, including, and that goes, and then how does that practically execute is workforce development. And that's likely heavily in the community colleges, Mass Maritime, right? Because that's the first thing industry says is can't find any, there's no skills, because the skills have all gone overseas in the last 4 years.
Eric, yes, please.
Yeah, so Bob, I really appreciate what you said. And I completely agree. And it makes me think that what is a crisis? A crisis is an awful, dangerous situation that occurs that the existing system is not equipped to handle. And so all of these things are happening and we don't have systems in place to sort of handle them quietly or naturally. And so in talking about the job, and another note I was going to share with you, Kevin, as I wrote down, a crisis is that if we had 1,000 people right now who are ready to work, we wouldn't have jobs for them. And if we had 1,000 jobs we needed to fill, we wouldn't have 1,000 people to fill them. So how is that contradictory observation true? And yet it's true. And it is the situation. And the crisis in the offshore wind industry is we can't build projects because we haven't built a supply chain. And so I to your point, Kevin, about being conscious and intentional, it's like we have to be conscious and intentional. And if we train somebody, I mean, Jen, if somebody gets trained, what if they have 4 months between when they're done being trained and they need to go get a job? And they can't go sign a 6-month contract with somebody because so then how do you support them for 4 months? Or how do you support and we don't have the most basic mechanisms to keep people from like falling off the cliffs and through the cracks as they're navigating this transition. And I think we don't even have a language culturally to do that, because that's always been it's always been labeled as some kind of socialistic thing. So like, how do we create a language that allows us to do sensible things to meet a crisis?
One thing, on the language part is the offshore wind is going to require infrastructure. And most people think traditional infrastructure is concrete and steel I-beams. Infrastructure today is technology, smartness, but also, Bob, to your point, there's now funding to go into the Port of Providence and electrify, put in chargers. So there's less diesel engines in that neighborhood, which has the high asthma rates for kids of color. But the connection is not necessarily obvious. There's still the traditional thinking is we don't have the offtakes like they have in Europe where they put biodiversity over the others, but it's an amazing opportunity, I think, for us on real spending, and infrastructure should include a less impactful. What we've heard in the past was, who's going to pay for that? I'm not going to electrify. It's the port. Who's paying for it? Now, actually, there is somebody that can pay for it, either at the IRA or it's going to flow down from the PPAs.
Thank you, everyone, for that. I think really valuable comments and discussion. You know, these are going to be great for the